The valley had a way of humbling people. It came in the form of a wind that never quite stopped, a sky so wide it made a man feel small as a fence post, and neighbors who watched every decision like it was their own money being spent. In the autumn of 1883, deep in a Wyoming territory hollow, where the cottonwoods were just beginning to release their golden leaves into Bitter Creek, a young couple stood at the edge of their claim and counted what they had left. He was 26, broad through the shoulders from 2 years of breaking sod, with hands that had grown calloused enough to grip a fence staple bare. She was 24, slight but steady, the kind of steady that came from choosing not to show fear even when it sat right beside her at the breakfast table. They had come out from Ohio the spring before last with a wagon, a milk cow, seed corn, and a dream that looked considerably better on paper than it did on this particular gray October morning. The cow had gone dry in August. The corn had come in thin after a July that forgot to rain. They had $41 between them, kept in a blue tin behind the flour sack, and a cabin that was honest about its shortcomings. One window, a door that swelled shut in damp weather, and a chimney that drew well only when the wind came from the southwest. They had made it work, both of them, the way young couples on the frontier made things work, through a kind of stubborn, quiet devotion to the idea that tomorrow might be better than today. She had traded mending for sugar and salt. He had split fence rails for the Halverson place all summer for 50 cents a cord. They had eaten a great deal of cornmeal mush and had not complained about it to each other. But winter was 6 weeks away, and the larder was leaner than pride allowed a person to admit. It was on a Thursday, when he drove the buckboard into Millhaven for flour and harness leather, that he first heard about the pigs. Old Reuben Schacht was standing outside the feed store with the particular expression of a man who has made a bad decision and is looking for someone to pass it along to. 3 blind hogs, he said, came in a lot with a dozen others. Couldn't be sold at proper price. Nobody wanted them. Couldn't see a fence line. Couldn't find a trough without help. Would be a pure fool's errand to try raising them through winter. He said the price. It was low enough to be almost insulting. The man in the buckboard was quiet for a moment, looking down the main street of Millhaven at nothing in particular, thinking in the way he sometimes did, slow and all the way through. Then he asked where the pigs were. He found the pigs in a back pen behind Schacht's feed store, rooting in the mud with the particular determination of animals who have learned the world must be understood through the nose alone. 3 of them. 2 sows and a young boar, all of a pale reddish color that might have been handsome on a sighted animal. They bumped the fence rails gently as they moved, correcting without panic, turning their broad snouts into the autumn air as he leaned over the top rail and watched them. He was not a man given to sentiment about livestock. He had butchered hogs before and expected to again, but there was something in the way they moved that held him. Methodical, unhurried, working the ground with a kind of patient industry that reminded him, in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone, of his wife on the days the work was hardest. He paid Schacht the price. It was $4.70, which was nearly everything left in the flat tin he kept under the floorboard. Schacht took the coins with the look of a man who has gotten the better of a fool and feels mildly guilty about it. He did not say that aloud. He did say, loud enough for the 2 men leaning by the door to hear, that those hogs would be dead before January. The drive home was 6 miles on a road that had gone to mud with the October rains. The 3 pigs loaded into the buckboard bed in a wooden crate borrowed from behind the store. They were quiet on the ride, which surprised him. He had expected distress. Instead, they simply settled against one another with the ease of animals long accustomed to sharing warmth and space. She was at the fence line when he came up the lane, turning from where she had been examining the apple trees. The old ones, wild and unpruned, that leaned along the eastern edge of their property line in a tangle of gray limbs. They had dropped their fruit early this year, a carpet of small, bruised apples across the grass that neither of them had known quite what to do with. He stopped the buckboard. She looked at the crate, then at him. He told her what he had paid. He told her about the blindness. He did not soften either fact, because she had never once asked him to. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking carefully, rather than being unhappy. So then she walked to the buckboard and looked through the slats of the crate, and the young boar lifted his nose toward her, reading the air. She put one finger through the slat and the boar sniffed it, his pink nostrils working with that same unhurried industry. She said nothing for a moment. Then she looked up at him and asked how long the apples would keep if they were stored in the root cellar. He told her he did not know for certain, but he thought some weeks if they were kept cool and dry and not stacked too deep. She nodded once, still looking at the boar, and then she said she would go start sorting them that afternoon. That was how she worked through things that troubled her, with motion, with purpose, with her hands finding the next task before her mind had fully settled the last one. He had learned to read the difference between her silence that meant worry and her silence that meant calculation, and this was the second kind. She was already measuring in her head. He could see it in the way her eyes moved slightly, the way she pressed her lips together with something close to determination. They carried the crate to the lean-to on the north side of the barn, where the shade kept longest through the afternoon. The 3 pigs shifted inside it with low sounds, bumping against one another without urgency. He watched them settle. The sow put her snout down and began working at a gap in the bottom slat, methodical and patient, as though she had all the time available in the world. The 2 boars sorted themselves into corners. None of them seemed distressed. None of them seemed diminished by what they lacked. So they occupied their small space with a kind of easy authority that struck him as quietly admirable. She came back from the root cellar with a bucket of the smallest apples, the ones too bruised or too misshapen to be worth much else. She set the bucket near the crate and unlatched the front panel carefully. One hand braced in case they rushed. They did not rush. The sow found the apples first, nosing through the pile with a delicacy that seemed almost considered, choosing one and working it back in her jaws with patient pleasure. The 2 boars followed, each finding his place without contest. She watched them eat. He watched her watching them. After a while, she said that the apples would not last past October. He agreed. She said that meant they needed another feed source established before winter closed in hard. So he said he had been thinking about the cracked corn they could get from the Halverson mill, the sweepings and the culled grain that usually went to chickens. It was cheap because nobody valued it highly. She said that was good, that was a start, and then she asked about sweet clover, whether any was still standing along the creek bottom. He said there was some. She said they could cut it and dry it in bundles before the first frost, stack it in the barn corner under the loft where the air moved. He looked at her. She looked back at him with that level steadiness that had held them through harder things than 3 blind pigs and a lean autumn. She said they would need to build a better pen before the ground froze. He started on the pen the next morning while the mist was still thick along the creek bottom. The existing fence was little more than a suggestion. Split rails stacked without posts deep enough to matter. Gaps a determined hog could push through on a slow afternoon. The 3 pigs had not tested it yet, but they were feeling stronger by the day, and he knew better than to wait on a fence until after it failed. She came out an hour after sunrise with his second cup of coffee and stood at the fence line, studying what he had already torn down. She said it was worse than she remembered. He said it was worse than he had remembered too, and that the posts had heaved with the last frost cycle, leaving them loose as bad teeth. She handed him the coffee and looked at the timber he had hauled from the woodlot. Cedar posts she had agreed were worth pulling, even though they were not straight-grained and clean the way a proper lumberman would have wanted. She said they would do fine. He said he was going to set them 3 feet deep and pack the holes tight with the clay-heavy subsoil from the creek bank. Let the moisture work in their favor for once. She went back to the garden to harvest the last of the dried beans before the week's rain came and stripped the pods from the stalks. He dug post holes until his shoulders ached through the back and into his chest, then kept digging. The blind sow came to the fence corner and pressed her broad nose against the lower rail, reading the air, tasting the turned earth with whatever sense the dark had sharpened in her. He talked to her while he worked. Not in the way a man talks to be heard, but in the low, even way he talked to the mule when the footing was bad. Steady sound meaning steady hands, meaning nothing to fear. By afternoon, she had finished the beans and come back with 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and a handful of the dried clover they had cut that morning. She dropped the clover over the fence and watched all 3 pigs come to it with their careful, deliberate shuffle. She said the sow had gained in her hips even since last week. He said he thought so too. They ate their biscuits standing at the half-built fence in the thin October light. Neither spoke for a while. There was something in the quiet between them that felt earned. Not comfortable exactly, but solid. And the way the new posts already felt solid even before he had strung the rails. She said the pen needed to be large enough that the pigs could move and root without standing in their own waste, that it would matter to the meat, that she had read something once about how a stressed animal ate poorly and grew poorly, and that flavor lived all the way down in how a creature had spent its days. He set his coffee down and looked at her with full attention. He said, "Say that again." She said it slower this time, the way she might repeat a measurement she was not certain he had caught. That flavor lived all the way down in how a creature had spent its days. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned a board to check its grain. He had never thought about meat that way. He had thought about feed and water and weather and slaughter weight, the practical arithmetic of livestock, kept by every farm family he had ever known. He had not thought about the days themselves as an ingredient. She had read it in a pamphlet, she said, one of the agricultural circulars that came through the mercantile and went mostly unread, stacked beside the seed catalogs and left for anyone who wanted them. She had taken one in the spring, meaning to read about kitchen gardens, but it had wandered into a long passage about European swine rearing. The old methods, the slow methods, the ones that let animals walk and root and find their own rhythm before they were ever brought to slaughter. The writer had been dismissive of it, she said, calling it impractical and sentimental. But she had kept the pamphlet and thought about it more than she expected to. He asked whether she believed it. She said she believed that a creature poorly kept put its energy into distress rather than into growing well, and that seemed plain enough without needing a pamphlet to prove it. He nodded. He looked at the pen layout he had staked out and saw that he had been thinking of it only as enclosure, walls to keep the animals in. She was thinking of it as a kind of life, something the pigs would inhabit for months, something that would work on them the way weather worked on wood. He pulled up one of the stakes he had driven and moved it 6 feet west, opening the near corner of the pen toward a low run of ground where the grass grew thick and the apple drops from the 2 old trees at the field edge collected after wind. She watched him do it without a word, and then she took the other stake at the far end and moved it to match. Together they walked the new boundary, pressing the amended line into the soil with their heels. The pen was now perhaps a third larger than what he had planned. It would cost him more fence rail and another half-day of work. He did not mention the cost. She did not apologize for the change. There was nothing to apologize for. She said the sow in particular seemed to navigate by smell rather than sight, quartering the ground with her nose down in a long, slow arc, and that she had started to anticipate where the apples fell, which meant she was already learning the particular shape of this place. He said that was something. She said she thought it was more than something. The fence rail cost him 2 days, not 1. The timber he had hoped to split clean ran contrary to the grain and gave him grief at every other log, forcing him to work around knots the size of his fist, angling the maul until his shoulders ached past the point of complaint. She brought him water twice and did not tell him to rest, because she knew him well enough to know that telling him to rest was the same as telling him to doubt himself, and she would not do that. She left the water and went back to the garden, where the late squash were swelling on the vine and needed turning so the groundside wouldn't rot. By the 3rd evening, the pen stood complete, corners squared close enough to satisfy him, the rails pegged double at the joints the way his father had taught him. He stood back and looked at it in the low amber light with his hat in his hand. And she came to stand beside him, drying her hands on her apron. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. It was the kind of quiet that meant something. The 3 pigs had settled already into a shared habit. Mornings, the barrow moved first, exploring the east corner where the ground was softest. The 2 gilts followed at a remove, the smaller one staying close to the sow that was not truly her mother, but had seemed to accept her as something near enough. By midday, they were lying in a loose pile against the shaded rail, their sides moving slow and easy. The apple drop from the 2 old trees at the field edge was not yet heavy. The season was still building toward its full generosity, but what fell was enough to give the 3 animals something to seek. And seeking, she had come to understand, was what kept them at their best. She had begun adding crushed dried clover to the cracked corn she poured into the feed trough, a small adjustment that had cost her an evening of extra work. But that seemed to settle the pigs in a way plain corn did not. She had read nothing to suggest it. It was instinct, or something close enough to instinct that the difference did not matter. He had not questioned it. He had noticed the pigs' coats were coming in smoother and mentioned it once at supper, and she had said she thought the clover might have something to do with it, and he had nodded and asked if she needed more clover cut, and she said not yet, but perhaps in a week. That was how they talked about the pigs now. Not as a gamble, not as the source of the town's amusement, not as a mistake being slowly corrected. They talked about them the way you talked about something you had staked a portion of yourself on, carefully, with a kind of earned seriousness that had no room left in it for embarrassment. The first real apple fall came on a Tuesday. The apples came down overnight, shaken loose by a wind that had rolled in cold off the mountains and set the whole orchard trembling. By morning, the ground beneath the three gnarled trees at the east edge of their claim was thick with fallen fruit, some bruised, some split, a few still holding their shape well enough that she might have brought them inside for keeping. She did not bring them inside. She stood at the orchard's edge in the early gray light and looked at the scattered apples and felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time, which was a quiet, spreading certainty that things were going right. He had the gate to the small pen open before she came back to tell him. He had heard the wind in the night, too, and he had lain awake thinking about it, and by the time the sky was pale enough to see by, he was already pulling on his boots. They did not need to speak much. She held the gate, and he walked the pigs out, one at a time, each one blinking and uncertain in the open air, until the smell of the apples reached them, and then there was nothing uncertain about them at all. The three hogs moved through the fallen fruit with a kind of slow, absorbed contentment that he had not seen in any animal before. Not in cattle, not in the horses he had worked beside, not in the yard, chickens that scratched at everything with frantic energy. The pigs selected. They pressed their broad snouts against one apple, then moved to another, choosing by some measure he could not name. They were unhurried. They ate with a seriousness that almost made him want to laugh, except that watching them, he found he could not. She stayed at the fence long after she had any practical reason to stay there. The morning light was coming in low and warm now, catching the dew on the grass and the pale undersides of the remaining apples still hanging in the trees above. One of the pigs had found a particularly good patch near the old stone wall at the orchard's far edge and had settled there, working steadily, not lifting its head. He came to stand beside her at the fence. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then she said that she thought they ought to do this every morning while the fall lasted. Bring them out at first light and let them work through whatever the night had shaken down before the day warmed, and the fruit began to soften too much in the sun. He said that sounded right to him. She said they would need to watch the weight, that pigs could founder on too much rich fruit if a person wasn't careful, and he said he would keep an eye on the smaller one in particular, who had always eaten faster than the other two and seemed to know no natural limit. She nodded and did not move from the fence. The smaller one had been a concern since the very beginning. Since the afternoon they had first brought all three home in the back of the wagon, thin and shaking, and none of them able to see the road passing beneath them. That one had pressed its nose against the slats and made a sound unlike the others, higher and more urgent, as if it understood something about its own condition that the rest did not. She had noticed it then, and she noticed it still. There was a quality to its hunger that was different from ordinary appetite. It did not eat from pleasure or routine. It ate as if it were making up for something. She had read what she could find about hogs, which was not much. There was a passage in one of the agricultural pamphlets they had sent away for in the spring that spoke about the danger of acidic fruit in large quantities, how it could upset the digestion and cause a pig to go off its feed entirely, or worse, to bloat in a way that could not be easily corrected. She had underlined it with a pencil and folded the corner of the page down so she could find it again, because she had thought about it often in those first weeks when the apples were coming down fast after the early frost, and the animals were eating more than she had planned for. What she had worked out, slowly and through close watching, was that the cracked corn was the key. If she gave them a measure of corn before the orchard time, something to settle in the stomach and take up some of the space, the fruit became a pleasure rather than a flood. The smaller ones still ate fast. That did not change, but it did not founder, and its sides filled out in a way that was steady and even, not the puffed and unhealthy look she had feared. He had watched her figure this out without saying much. That was his way. He was not a man who commented on a thing while it was still in progress. He waited until a method had proven itself, and then he said, plainly, that it looked like she had the right of it. She valued that more than she had expected to when they had first come out here together. There was something in being known by someone who did not flatter you, who only said a thing because it was true. The sun was climbing now, and the dew was beginning to lift off the grass in that thin, hovering way it had in October mornings. The fruit on the ground near the stone wall was still cool and firm. In another hour it would not be. She watched the largest one move slowly from one apple to the next, choosing with something that resembled deliberateness, and she thought about the smokehouse and when they might reasonably begin to think about the building of it. She had been turning the smokehouse question over for 2 weeks now, the way she turned problems that mattered, quietly, and without rushing toward a conclusion before the shape of it was clear. She had seen a smokehouse once, back in Missouri, a low stone building with a narrow door and a vent hole cut near the peak of the roof. She had not thought much of it at the time. She had not expected to need the knowledge, but she found now that she had held on to more than she realized. The way you hold on to certain things without meaning to, because some part of you understands their value before your mind catches up. He had already begun collecting stone from the creek bank, carrying them up in the wagon 2 or 3 loads a week, stacking them near the east side of the barn where the ground was level and the afternoon shade came long. She had not asked him to. He had simply begun doing it, which was how he approached most things he believed in. And the stone was good gray limestone, flat-faced and solid, the kind that laid well without much chinking if you took care with the selection. She had drawn the dimensions in the dirt with a stick one evening while he watered the horses. 8 feet by 10, she had figured. Low walls, no taller than a man's shoulder, with a pitched roof, and the vent hole placed to draw the smoke up and out, without letting it billow back and sour the meat. The door would face north, away from the prevailing wind, to keep the temperature inside steadier. She had worked that out herself, by watching how the wind moved across their land through the different hours of the day, and she felt quiet confidence in the reasoning. The hogs were not ready yet. That was the honest truth of it, and she held on to the truth carefully, because rushing was the thing that would ruin it. They were perhaps 6 weeks from where she wanted them. Still growing, still taking on the slow, deep fat that came from patient feeding and clean forage and unhurried days in the sun. She had watched a leanness she disliked in October give way to something more promising, a settling in of the flesh that spoke of health rather than excess, and she believed they were on the right course. She walked back toward the cabin to start the morning fire and think through the mortar. River clay mixed with ash and a little sand. She had read about it somewhere, or perhaps been told. She was not entirely sure the proportions were right, and she intended to ask him what he thought, because he had worked with stone before she had, and there was never any shame in asking a question of someone who knew. He was already awake when she came in, sitting at the small table with a cup of bitter chicory warming his hands and a piece of flat shale balanced across his knees. He had been sketching something with a charred stick, lines and angles that she recognized as the smokehouse wall, the place where the firebox met the chamber. He looked up when the door opened, and she could see he had been thinking hard about the same problem. She told him about the river clay, about ash and sand, and he nodded slowly the way he did when something confirmed a thought already moving in his mind. "It needs to breathe a little," he said. "Too dense, and it cracks straight through the first hot firing." He pointed to a line on the shale where he had drawn a thin channel running through the mortar joint. Not a gap exactly. It's just a looseness in the mix that lets the heat pass without fighting the stone. She studied the drawing. She asked him about the proportion of ash, and he said he thought 1 part ash to 3 of clay, with the sand just enough to keep it from shrinking as it dried. He was not certain either, and he said so plainly, and she appreciated that they had always been able to say plainly when they were not certain. They spent that morning gathering what they needed from along the creek bank, pulling clay from a cut in the bank where the water had exposed a clean seam of it, gray-blue and smooth. He carried it in a canvas sack, and she carried the ash in a pail she had saved from the wood stove, fine white ash, the good kind. They mixed it on a flat stone near the smokehouse and worked it with their hands until it felt right. So plastic and smooth and just a little gritty with the sand. He pressed a handful against the stone wall to test the adhesion, and they both watched it. It held. They worked through the afternoon patching the joints they had worried over, the ones near the firebox especially, where every smoking would stress the mortar most. She smoothed the seams with a wet rag, and he tapped the stones gently to seat them. And by the time the light began to go gold across the valley floor, they had finished the section they had planned. She stood back and looked at it and felt something she had learned to trust over these years. A quiet certainty that was not pride exactly, but something steadier than hope. The structure was sound. The work had been careful. The hogs were 6 weeks from where she wanted them, so and now the smokehouse was 6 weeks closer to being ready to receive them. The mornings turned sharp in the last week of October, the kind of cold that came down from the high ridges before dawn and settled into the low ground where the hogs slept in their deep straw. She had lined the pen walls with extra planking on the north side, and he had banked dried grass against the base to keep the ground frost from creeping under the boards. The hogs had grown into themselves in a way that still moved her to look at them. Broad across the shoulder, round in the haunch, their coats thick now and their movements deliberate, unhurried, the way healthy animals move when they have been given enough time and enough of the right things. She kept a tally in a small notebook she had carried since Kansas, a worn thing with a leather cover soft as cloth. In it she tracked what each animal weighed by approximation, what they had eaten over the week, how they had behaved. It was a farmer's record, but she had kept it with a care that went beyond practical habit, the way someone writes in a journal when the subject matters deeply to them. He had looked at it once and not said much, only nodded, which she understood to mean that he saw what she was doing and respected it. He spent 3 days that week cutting and splitting a cord of hickory he had located the previous spring on a wooded bench above the creek. He had marked the trees then, knowing what they would be needed for, knowing even then that the smokehouse would be built and the hams would come. That kind of quiet, forward thinking was the thing she had loved in him from early on. The way he worked in long time rather than short. The way he trusted a plan even when the ground between start and finish looked uncertain. She had watched him load the split wood into the wagon and drive it down, stack it neat under the lean-to on the south side of the smokehouse, where it would continue to dry in what sun remained. Hickory needed to be dry or the smoke turned bitter, and he knew this the way he knew most things about wood, from long attention. They did not speak much that week, but the silence between them had the texture of something full rather than empty. There was so much understood now, so much that had been worked through and arrived at together, that words had become one way of communicating among several. A glance across the pen while she filled the water trough, the way he handed her a tool before she asked for it. The small steadiness of two people who have found their working rhythm and no longer need to announce it. The first snow came on a Thursday, early enough in the season that it surprised no one who had lived in that valley more than a year. She stood at the door of the cabin and watched it settle on the roof of the smokehouse, soft and particular, the way snow always made familiar things look briefly new. Inside the smokehouse, the hams were hanging in their proper darkness. Past the green cure now, past the first long smoke, well into that slow finishing that could not be hurried by any means she knew of. He came up from the pen, stomping his boots on the step, and stood beside her in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The snow kept falling with the patient industry of something that had no opinion about whether it was wanted. She thought about the morning they had driven those 3 small pigs home, how thin they were, how the whole town had found something to say about it. She had heard the laughter and chosen not to let it settle in her, the way you step around mud on a path. He had done the same, though his jaw had been tight that evening, and she had known enough not to mention it. All of that felt very far away now. He put his arm around her shoulder, and she leaned into him the small, necessary degree that meant she felt it. The smokehouse stood in the yard the way a good decision stands in a life, solid and useful, a thing that had required patience and was now simply there. The orders for next season were already written in her ledger, more than they could fill from one curing, which meant they would plan for more in spring. Not so many that the quality would drift. She was firm about that. What made the ham what it was could not be separated from the care that went into it, and she would not trade the one for the other at any price. He knew this. He agreed with it completely. That was one of the things that had always made their work together clean and without argument at the places that mattered most. The snow covered the wood pile under the lean-to, covered the fence rails, covered the dark turned earth of the kitchen garden, where nothing grew now but possibility. Come spring, the ground would be soft and ready. Come spring, the new piglets would be chosen carefully, 3 or 4 of the best, and the whole patient, beautiful work would begin again. She reached up and put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. The valley was white and quiet. The smokehouse held what they had built from nothing. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, a life.